Greetings. My name is Alex Keena. I'm an associate professor of political science here at VCU. And on behalf of the Institute for Democracy, Pluralism, and Community Empowerment, I'm pleased to present our first event of the year entitled On the Brink, Political Violence in the 2024 Election. And as the title of the panel implies, we put this panel together rather quickly in response to the assassination attempt on former President Trump, who's the Republican candidate for president. However, rather than speculate about the motive of the attack or attribute blame, much like you've probably seen on cable TV news if you've tuned in, our purpose here is to take a long view and to think about this from an academic perspective so that we can elevate the discourse around the assassination attempt and situate this within its proper historical perspective. And so we've assembled a panel of experts here at VCU that whose work intersects with political violence. And so I'm going to introduce the panelists, and I'm also going to open the floor up for potential questions that you might have. And throughout this event, I will draw upon questions that we received in advance. And if you feel like you have a question, I encourage you to please send in your questions, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So we anticipate that we'll start with some introductions, followed by some brief remarks by each of our panelists. And then following that, we'll go directly into questions. So let me introduce our panelists. Emilie Raymond specializes in 20th century American political culture. Her work focuses on Hollywood and politics, as well as the influence of the civil rights movement, women's activism, and conservatism in American life. She is the author of From My Cold Dead Hands, Charlton Heston and American Politics. That's University of Kentucky Press in 2006. And Stars for Freedom, Hollywood, Black Celebrities, and the Civil Rights Movement. That's University of Washington Press in 2016. Currently, she's writing a dual biography of Paul and Phyllis Galante entitled Bring Paul Home, Love and Heroism During the Vietnam War. We also have Jessica Trisko Darden. She is an associate professor in Department of Political Science and the director of the Insecurity Lab, which examines individuals' lived experiences with insecurity and violence to engage questions of agency, accountability, and justice at the individual, community, and structural levels. She also directs the Security and Foreign Policy Initiative at William & Mary's Global Research Institute and was previously a Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at American Enterprises Institute. And lastly, but not least, we have Amanda Wintersieck. She is an associate professor of political science and director of the Institute for Democracy, Pluralism, and Community Empowerment here at VCU. Her research focuses in political behavior and political communication. Specifically, she's interested in the effects of political campaigns on voters' evaluations of candidates, on the role the media plays in citizens' vote choice, and the conditions that advantage a candidate's campaign. Her current work focuses on the role of news media and the impact of electoral context in political campaigns. Her work has appeared in a variety of scholarly journals. She's also, in addition to her role as director of IDPCE, Dr. Wintersieck serves as the immediate past president of the Southern Political Science Association, SPSA Women Caucus, and she is the current secretary of the American Political Science Association Civic Engagement Section. So let's start with each of the panelists, and we have some time for each panelist to share some brief remarks. So let's begin with Professor Trisko Darden.
Sure, I don't actually have any remarks prepared, so I think that I will just comment on why we felt it was important to come together in this moment to address this issue. We've seen over the past decade, if not more, increasingly divisive rhetoric, not only in American politics, in Congress, in the media, but more generally in social life in the United States. And this is not part of just an American trend. It's a global phenomenon. We're seeing increasing attacks on politicians in the United States, of course, but also more broadly throughout Europe, as well as regions further afield. And so in my own work, I examine dynamics relating to youth participation and women's participation in political violence. And having that broader foreign context gives me a very important perspective and a broader understanding of these dynamics then I hope will allow us to get into some deeper questions about what's going on here in the United States. And as we come together to discuss past and future trajectories of political violence in this country, I want to really stress that this is not America's challenge alone. We are one of many nations facing these challenges in both consolidated democracies and new democracies. And so we should never feel alone in this struggle, in this conversation, but it is a very crucial issue. And then I appreciate all of you taking time here tonight to have this conversation with us.
Great. And Professor Raymond, do you have any remarks you'd like to share before we get to the question and answer segment?
Sure. I would thank you for involving me in this. And I agree with Professor Darden that it's not simply an American issue, but as a historian, I, of course, am thinking kind of broadly in terms of what this means for America. And one of the things that, I've been thinking a lot about is what the framers were writing about and thinking about, during the revolution and its aftermath, and in constructing the American Constitution. And the framers, as we all know, really feared a king, but they also really feared mob rule, in part because they felt that mob rule would lead to violence and violence would lead to a king, so it kind of all goes back to that. But there was a lot of mechanisms put in place into the US Constitution to try to cool passions and to avoid mob rule. So this is something that they always knew was there. It's a difficult balance between sort of the freedom and the individual liberties that we want and pride ourselves in America, but also the stability that we have to have, and the rule of law that we have to have a productive nation. So I think that, maybe not assassinations per se were what the framers were thinking about, but political violence very broadly, whether it was on behalf of a mob or a group or an individual, is something that we've concerned ourselves with from the very, very beginning, and we've seen throughout American history.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Wintersieck, if you'd like to conclude with some remarks.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Trisko Darden and Dr. Raymond, for your remarks. I think we're going to have a really nice conversation here, and I am really pleased with the level of expertise and the diversity of expertise here today. From my perspective as a scholar of political behavior, this is a moment that is really concerning, and not just this moment, but the decade leading up to this moment. We are now in a third highly contentious presidential election. Tensions are high, and it has culminated with the attempted assassination of a major presidential candidate. And I think that it's important that at this moment we say that as Americans, we have to be recommitted to fighting out our differences at the ballot box and to airing our differences in the public square on our soapboxes. That there is no room for the types of political violence that we saw this past weekend or that we've seen through the course of the last decade or so in America. And I want to reiterate that these types of events have a lasting impact on the way people engage in politics, and in particular our youth. And we have a real mission and an opportunity at this moment to teach our youth how to engage in better civil dialogue, how to be better democratic citizens and stewards of their democracy. And if we don't make the right choice, if we don't take the time and put in the effort to make our democracy what we want it to be, we run the risk of demobilizing this generation of students, this generation of young people, much like we saw in the 1960s after a series of assassinations of major political figures, from JFK to RFK to Malcolm X. And so, I mean, among other things in the 60s, this leads to some demobilization effect. And so I really want to have a conversation about how we get back on track to recommit to our democratic values as Americans first and foremost, perhaps setting aside our partisan differences to the extent that we can.
Thank you. So for our first question, Professor Raymond, I hope you don't mind if I pick on you here since you're the historian of the group. One question that I think is really relevant for this is the historical context of violence. So perhaps could you speak about the history of political violence in the US and how it's shaped American politics and society, perhaps some examples of political violence in American history and the long-term impacts of those events?
Yes. I mean, I focus on 20th century, so that's always what pops into mind first for me. But there's been political violence, basically from the very beginning, during the Revolutionary era, from revolutionaries, people who were going after British tax collectors, for political reasons, tarring and feathering, that kind of attack. There were lynchings throughout the 19th century as a form of, vigilante justice, sometimes for legitimate reasons and many other times not for legitimate reasons. But still, I would say political violence. There were people trying to exercise power, and largely through political ways. We've seen occupations and destruction of property as a way of exerting some sort of political control. Even in the temperance movement, there was a famous temperance activist, Carrie Nation, who would go in and with a hatchet, and try to bust up a saloon and try to, destroy all the bottles of alcohol. But then, sometimes these occupations will lead to permanent damage, whether they're terrorizing individuals or hurting people or burning down buildings. And then those are all sort of more of the kind of mob situations, I guess. And then there's individual assassinations and bombings. And there's plenty of examples of that in American history too, in the 19th century and the 20th, with the assassination of President Lincoln, on President Garfield, McKinley. Those were all in the 19th century, and those were all generally for political purposes, although the people involved generally did have political issues. And the 20th century too, with I'd say kind of the outlier, is Reagan. The person who tried to shoot Reagan really didn't have a political motive. He was more of a delusions of grandeur type. And we don't really know with this current situation against Trump with Thomas Matthew Crooks if he had a political motive or not. But it does seem that there are a lot of examples that we can look at, and there are waves that they come in. And in the 1960s, I mean, I know a lot of people have been paralleling now with 1968, and there are a lot of comparisons, I think that we could draw. There were campus occupations in 1968, partly over civil rights activism, especially Black Power, but also over the Vietnam War. So the campus occupations that have to do with Israel and Hamas, there's some parallels there. There were street protests in 1968, just like there are now. The Democratic Party was pretty divided in 1968, like now. They had The Democratic National Convention was in Chicago, just like it's going to be this year. And there were actual assassinations. By this time, in 1968, 2 people had been killed, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And this was after a lot of political violence against civil rights activists throughout the 1960s. Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and the 4 little girls in Birmingham. You know, there's a lot of examples that we can draw on. So I think 2024 is similar to 68. We had campus occupations. They were much fewer, and the context of the war was a lot different. I think we're having street protests, but there are fewer of those as well, and they're not nearly as widespread or as destructive as they were in 1968. The Democrats are divided similarly. I think that is a very strong parallel. We don't know what's going to happen in Chicago. And we can say that no one has been assassinated in our political landscape. So even though there are some striking similarities to 1968, I still feel like things are much better. And hopefully that's a good sign, you know, that we can help reel things in. And you know, and things I would say peaked in 68, but they didn't end. There was an assassination attempt against George Wallace. There were the shootings at Kent State University and Jackson State University. So I think even though it peaked then, there was still a lot of troubling things that were happening. You know, one thing that I was reminded of in reading about some of these violent attempts was how Shirley Chisholm visited George Wallace in the hospital, and how that was sort of a famous sort of olive branch, considering how opposed to one another they were on a lot of issues, and they were running against one another on the presidential ticket. But, you know, I think just small acts like that, personal acts, are things that our political leaders can do, and we ourselves can do to help lower the temperature.
Thanks. Dr. Trisko Darden, I think I already know the answer to this, but are these types of events, these acts of political violence, are these like a uniquely American phenomenon, or what is your perspective as somebody who studies international relations, somebody who studies political violence? What are some of the risk factors for this type of violence? And maybe you can talk about examples that you find in other contexts, not simply the United States.
So I think one important difference between the United States and other countries and contexts, and something that I'm sure we'll touch upon, is the constitutional protection of freedom of speech. And the United States has the most profound speech protections in the world. There are nevertheless constraints on the freedom of speech, and we can discuss those a little bit later. But the American approach to hate speech differs radically from the rest of the world. So to give you an example, Jack Black's musical partner made a joke about the assassination attempt on President Trump during a concert in Australia. Australia has strong hate speech laws, strong terrorism laws, and Australian politicians immediately began advocating for their deportation, right? For supporting an act of political violence in that country, right? I'm sure there have been lots of jokes in this country. None of those are going to rise to the level where law enforcement becomes involved, where politicians become involved, right? So I think that is an important distinction, and that distinction plays into the type of political discourse we have in this country, which has been increasingly characterized by violent rhetoric, by displays of arms, by language that creates us versus them dynamics, othering those with different political views or social views, right? And we see that happening in other countries as well. But many of those countries have tools at their disposal to either actually punish organizations that are propagating discriminatory speech or advocating for discriminatory or hateful policies, right? So Germany recently shut down a far-right newspaper that had a circulation of about 50,000 because it found that it violated its hate speech laws. And we can talk about whether or not that's the right path for polarization, right? Whether shutting down speech simply drives it underground, radicalizes individuals. But because of our speech protections, we don't have the same toolkit. What we do have that really works in our favor is a very long history of free and fair elections. We have a very high level of political participation in our country. We see very little violence on election day, and this contrasts with many new democracies around the world. So Kenya has a history of election day violence, but also now increasingly in the weeks running up to elections. We also saw widespread violence in Kenya recently relating to government policies, and President Ruto just dismissed his entire cabinet in response to widespread violence in the capital. We don't see that scale or intensity of political violence in our country, and I think we should be very grateful for that, and we should attribute it to our long history of pluralism, discourse, debate. But I do think that there are lessons that we can learn from other countries, as well as lessons that the United States has to offer other countries as well.
Great, thank you so much. And Dr. Wintersieck, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the political rhetoric and how it's evolved over time, and maybe how you see this as being linked to polarization in the United States.
Absolutely. I really appreciate Dr. Raymond's points about the violence and political violence being part of the American political story. But I want to argue perhaps that what makes this moment slightly different is the media environment that we exist in. Fortunately or unfortunately for the revolutionary folks, there was no such thing as Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. There also weren't shout shows that were yelling at you 24 hours a day. And so I think that we can't decouple a couple of major trends in American politics that we've seen since the late 1990s into the present day. In particular, a decline in trust in institutions, for example, like our election systems, institutions like our Congress, our Supreme Court, our federal bureaucracy, as well as a decline in trust between partisans. So, today, more than in 2016, Republicans and Democrats are much more likely to use nasty language about each other. They're much more likely to call each other closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, lazy, or some combination thereof. And I think that much of this decline in trust and, frankly, increase in hostility among partisans of opposing parties is very much related to the current media environment we find ourselves in. And I think that there are two components of this. The rise of Fox News and MSNBC as partisan analysis and shout shows, where 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you have pundits talking at you from a particular perspective. And we refer to this as the echo chamber, right? And so in having these conversations, they're reinforcing one side of the discussion instead of having a holistic debate about issues. This makes their arguments seem more reasonable because you're not hearing any counter arguments around this. We couple this with the fact that because this is a 24-hour media cycle and they need to entertain you and keep you in, they begin to treat politics much like a sport. And so this becomes about who's winning and who's losing, and about your team winning or losing at all costs, right? This becomes really problematic in that increases motivated reasoning. That is our directional goals to be right in our partisan biases rather than to be accurate in our beliefs. That is based in fact and evidence. And on top of that, the format yelling at you makes you more susceptible to manipulation, right? So when you have pundits yelling at you, what happens is you become agitated. And once you're in that state of agitation, your cortisol goes up, you are becoming more anxious. It makes you more malleable to these incoming messages. It also makes you more likely to fall prey or victim to some of these false narratives that have become pervasive in our political dialogue and narrative. This is then coupled in, the early aughts and into the teens with the rise of social media. And social media reinforces many of the worst tendencies of partisan punditry, in that we are existing in these spaces with people whom we're opting to interact with. So people who tend to be much like ourselves. On top of that, for example, if you're on Facebook, whether or not you've declared a partisanship, it's assigned one to you. It is decided that you are a Democrat or a Republican, and it's feeding into your feed this type of punditry that is one-sided. And so all of this combined makes us more willing to otherize people who aren't from our particular political persuasion. And that otherization makes it so that we are more forgiving of violence toward those individuals who have been dehumanized through this media process, right? It's no wonder that we are more likely to see our partisan opposites as unintelligent or lazy. All of these are things that we're trying to attach to people who are less deserving than we are on our side of being right. And so in thinking about this particular political moment, I don't think that we can ignore the media environment that we find ourselves in, and the responsibility of the media as the fourth branch of government to correct course and to make a decision for democracy and for people over capitalism and capitalistic gains, which is really the motivating factor that keeps these types of television shows on the air.
Thanks. And Dr. Trisko Darden, I'm going to come back to you again. When you think about presidents and presidential candidates, they're surrounded by an enormous security apparatus. It seems almost inconceivable that in the 21st century, given the resources that are invested in protecting high-profile candidates and politicians, that something like this could happen. But obviously, this is early on in the process and the investigation. But it seems like this was an example of a lone wolf attack where you had a guy with a gun who is sort of opportunistically there. And this is not isolated in American history. There have been other lone wolf attacks. The attack on Reagan that Dr. Raymond referenced. Indeed, several of the assassinations that we've had in our past appear to be lone wolf attacks. Why does there continue to be vulnerability to these types of attacks? Why do lone wolf shooters continue to pose so much of a threat?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'm going to tie back to what Dr. Wintersieck just said about particular social media and narratives, right? Driving beliefs and actions. And in a large part because we have so much information about individuals available to us through social media, right? I'm sure someone could figure out what I ate for lunch yesterday, right? The security apparatus of the state has invested enormous amounts of money and personnel time, right, to harness social media for threat identification, right, and to harness AI and big data for threat identification, which means that if you go on TikTok and say you're about to do something bad, it's going to get picked up, it's going to get identified, the FBI are going to look into it, and they're going to make an assessment about whether or not you pose a credible threat, right? And act accordingly. What has been really interesting about the ongoing FBI investigation into the assassination attempt on former President Trump is that that individual had a non-existent social media profile, right? They didn't have their phone on them. They didn't have any ID on them. They were trying to be as anonymous as possible. And that anonymity, right, factors into American politics in two ways. One, we have very little anonymity left in our lives, right? People know everything about us. And yet social media is the one space where we can still have a protected identity, right? We can have an avatar, we can have a name, we can have, encrypted media communication, all of this. So it enables us to engage in hostile discourse, violent discourse, in ways that will not be picked up by the security apparatus, because we can mask our identities in ways that we can't do in real life. At the same time, it enables conspiracy theories, organization, violent rhetoric to proliferate in ways that can inspire individuals who aren't even part of those social networks, right? So in an example, many people are aware, for instance, of QAnon conspiracy theories without knowing that they're linked to QAnon or knowing what QAnon is, right? And many of the QAnon conspiracies are linked to centuries-old anti-Semitic myths, right? So an individual will say, oh, I heard this wacky thing about the Clintons drinking blood, right? And that's because there's a QAnon conspiracy about that, but really that's about anti-Semitic blood libel, right? And so we're now so far removed in terms of our narratives from understanding their sources or what they're about. So back to lone wolves, right? Individuals are interacting with these different theories, with these different echo chambers, as Dr. Wintersieck said, but on the periphery. And because they're on the periphery, because they're not deeply engaged, they're harder to identify. So notably, the alleged shooter does not have a manifesto, does not have a social media profile, right? Is not seeking attention and the recognition in ways that many previous lone wolf attackers have. And that's made it exceptionally difficult for the ongoing investigation. So our security apparatus has focused in a post 9/11 environment on highly organized terrorist groups, which have digital footprints and physical footprints, and has not yet adapted to individuals who may be inspired by a particular belief or ideology, or who may have their own personal grievances or agenda, but who are not embedded in these networks. And to their credit, right, the FBI and other security agencies do an excellent job mitigating threats, right? Which is why everyone is identifying this historic failure. But it doesn't surprise me that when the system fails, it fails with these type of lone wolf actors.
So I want to take a moment to encourage the audience members to submit questions. If you have questions, we should have plenty of time to answer any questions that you have. I also have a few questions that I'm happy to ask, but this is an opportunity to ask our experts any questions that you might have and to draw upon their wisdom at this time of uncertainty. Dr. Raymond, I wanted to ask you about the evolution of violence and how historically, obviously, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, the United States is basically built intertwined with violence. The very beginning of the history of the United States is founded in a violent act. But my question is, what sort of parallels can we draw between the past, and your focus is on the 20th century, and there's no shortage of political violence in the 20th century, but what sort of parallels can we draw between the past and present? Is there any trends that come to mind when you think about that?
Well, I don't know. Feel like I sort of addressed this already with when I was talking about 1968. So could you?
Well, I was thinking about, well, like the profile of the ideologically motivated assassin who comes and tries to make either influence politics through a violent act or who tries to achieve some sort of fame or notoriety. And I'm thinking about for example, the assassination of James Garfield. You have a disgruntled would-be civil servant who wanted a job and wasn't necessarily trying to change politics, but was trying to act out a grievance. And then you have Reagan's assassination attempt. It didn't really seem to be politically motivated at all. But if you think about the assassination of JFK, uh, then that's an example of something where it does seem kind of politically motivated, or January 6th even, where you have not just one political actor, but multiple actors. So I wonder, is this unique to the time that we're living in now? Is this a product of the 20th century? Or is there something sort of deeper at work when we're looking at this tendency for people to try to like sway global events through acts of violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think like individual assassination attempts are distinct from sort of like larger waves of violence. But it does seem, and I've been influenced by a political scientist, Samuel Huntington, his book, The Politics of Disharmony. And he talks about how we have these periods of reform in American history. And he sees these periods as driven by what he calls the IVI gap. So kind of getting back to what Dr. Wintersieck was saying about institutions, that we have these American ideals of democracy, liberty, equality, individualism, rule of law under a constitution. And then we have the institutions that are supposed to help us achieve these ideals. And Huntington argues that when the gap between the IVI gap, when the gap between the ideals versus the institutions becomes too large, then we will see these reform efforts to bridge that gap, to bring them closer together. And he focused on the Revolutionary era, the Jacksonian era, the Progressive era, and what he called the S&S years, the 60s and the 70s. And I think that we are in a period of another one of these reform movements. And I don't know exactly what we would call it. I've been searching actually for the last couple of years to think of a good label for it, and I haven't come up with one. But he said, it was kind of cyclical. There was a generational element to it. It's been, 50 years since the last one. And it does seem like we're in the middle of another where we're trying to bridge that gap. And we've seen discontent with our institutions from a variety of different angles. We saw it with Occupy Wall Street 20 years ago, and we saw it with the Tea Party at almost the exact same time. And there are people coming from different vantage points, and they had different solutions, but a lot of their anger came down to this feeling that our institutions have failed us. And I don't think that has gone away, and it's grown, for a lot of people. So feeling that the political institutions with the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, and that's why we're seeing, I think, even though Robert Kennedy Jr. is a former Democrat, he is running on an independent ticket, and he has a lot of interest. The mainstream media, I mean, I agree. I certainly wouldn't want to ignore them either. And the cable shows and the shout shows, I agree with that they're super annoying. But a lot of people are tuning out of them. We have to remember that they have active viewers who have said, I'm not watching it anymore. And their like if you see their numbers, they're horrible. They get like 40,000 viewers on CNN sometimes in the evenings. So people are tuning out of that, and we're seeing independent journalism and podcasts and Substacks and all this sort of thing. so I think there is this collapse, and people are searching for something new, and whether that gap can be bridged is not just on our political leaders. We want them to be good leaders, of course, but it's also on ourselves, for finding a new way. So I guess this doesn't answer your question about lone wolves, but but historically, that's sort of how I feel kind of broadly where we are is in the middle of these one of these reformational sort of realignments, and within each of those, but especially the 60s and 70s I can talk about, is that there were violent reformers out there, and it's, when I think about anti-war activists who they felt like they weren't ending the war, so a subset of them decided they would bring the war home. They would bring the Vietnam War home by fighting in the streets and using guerrilla warfare in the streets. And so sometimes these reform efforts can become violent, and sometimes efforts to control them can become excessively violent. And usually when one side or the other seems to have lost its bearings in terms of their protests or the efforts to control them, public opinion tends to swing to the side that has not lost its bearings. So I'm starting to ramble. I'm sorry.
No, thank you so much for improvising with my improvised question.
Actually respond, Dr. Keena, would that be okay? I'd like to
Yes.
I think that one of the interesting things that we have to explore here, and to the audience, I'm sorry, but us people who are interested in politics, we really annoy the rest of America, right? We just really do. There's about 11% of Americans who don't care about politics at all, and for the most part, you can't convince them to participate. Then there's another 60-ish%, 70-ish% who are like in and out of politics. They sort of pay attention, but they mostly don't care from a day-to-day basis. And there's this very small group of Americans, less than 20%, who are the politicos, who are interested in politics, who are watching the news, who are reading the news, who are tuning into webinars on Thursday at 5:30 to talk about the state of political violence in our democracy. And we really annoy all of our neighbors, right? So, but I think that it's really important that we think about that group of politicos, that about 20% of Americans who really are interested in politics and where they're going, right? And so if we think about all of these great trends, or these trends that Dr. Raymond has brought up, from Occupy to the American Tea Party, these movements in America that had some violence associated with them at times really set us up for where we are today, because you're talking about a small group of Americans who are highly politically active and also becoming very extreme during this period in American politics. And they're becoming politically extreme because of their exposure to their echo chambers, whether that's cable news or their social media accounts. And that is the group of people who go and vote in every single primary election, and who put on the ballot for the other 70-ish% of Americans who sort of are on again, off again, and maybe care during a presidential election year, the major political candidates that we are left with on a ballot. And I think that as we have this conversation, we have to understand our own role as individuals who are uniquely interested in politics and really engaged, and the ways we're interacting with our political environment in a way that may not be healthy for us, number one, or for our democratic society more broadly. And so I think it remains to be seen that as people tune out of the shout shows and the partisan analysis, whether that is the 20% of individuals who are really politically involved, or if that's part of that on again, off again group of political participators. And that really makes a difference for how politics plays out in our country.
Great, thanks. We have a couple of really good questions from the audience, and I kind of want to combine them into a single question, and I'm going to let everybody respond if you like. It seems, Dr. Wintersieck, that your research probably a little kind of dovetails with this a little bit, but on the one hand, when we see episodes of violence like this, for most recently the assassination attempt against former President Trump, and perhaps before that, January 7th, January 6th, there are always calls to tone down the rhetoric. And one of the first sort of diagnoses that we see, at least in the political sphere, is that violence is a product of rhetoric. That politicians, when they use this type of rhetoric, when they take these absolutist positions, then it actually serves to incite violence. But on the other hand, the United States has more guns per capita than any other country, and it's not even close. There are a ton of guns out there, and there aren't a lot of other countries where a 20-year-old can just, have easy access to a long gun and take that to a place where a politician is speaking. So maybe talk about the role of guns and rhetoric, and maybe what do you think matters here? Obviously, they probably both matter, but I'm interested in your perspective, Dr. Wintersieck, and anyone else who feel free to jump in, and we can have a conversation about that.
Guns and rhetoric. I'm going to preface this with, I am not a gun expert or in terms of like gun policy or the number of guns out there. But I don't think that we can deny the link between mass violence in America and access to guns, and more importantly, the ability to carry out more brutal killings with a gun than, say, a knife, right? To bring it back to some of Dr. Trisko Darden's area of expertise, we've seen knife attacks fairly recently in several European countries that have resulted in deaths. And we know, had that been an AR-style weapon, that there would have been way more casualties of those events, much like we see in American political violence. One of the things we haven't brought up here with lone wolf shooters is American lone wolf shooters' proclivity toward not just trying to assassinate political figures, but toward killing our children in their schools and killing our citizens in their places of worship, right? This happens over and over, day in and day out. And so I think that I'll stop there and say there are policy experts that can tell you that answer. If you want to send me an email, I will find you those folks and you can go read their research and their reports. But in terms of the political rhetoric, yeah, I mean, it most certainly doesn't help, especially as we have developing information about this particular event and the motivations. It really does no good to point fingers at the other side, to say that, one person is responsible or their rhetoric is responsible for this. And I think that probably what's being alluded to is now Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance's comments immediately following the assassination attempt, that this is squarely on the heads of the Liberal Democrat Party because of their rhetoric. And it's hard to sort out these effects because there's legitimate concerns around President Donald Trump's fitness, or former President Donald Trump's fitness to be president, given some of the policies he says he would execute, right? Stripping the federal bureaucracy of expertise. That is very problematic for how our government runs on a day-to-day operation. It would be debilitating to our government if that were to happen, right? That is a legitimate criticism and critique of how he is a threat to our institutions of democracy and how our government operates on a day-to-day basis. Like, that's one of many examples. There are times, though, where it probably doesn't help to amp that rhetoric up. And so if you're looking for a way out, I would encourage you to tune out of that news. Like Dr. Raymond said, people are opting out. I'm going to be the first to admit that I have opted out. I have opted out of cable news. I didn't watch the convention. I will not watch the Democratic convention. But you know what I do is I go back the next day and I read the transcripts, because transcripts can't yell at you. And so I think that it's really important that as you're considering the ways you're going to consume political news and political rhetoric that comes along with that news, that you should put yourself in a space to put accuracy goals first, goals that are promoting first and foremost democratic values and principles of reasonable debate and political tolerance, and removing yourself from scenarios where you're likely to be taken for a ride by people who have a vested monetary interest in making sure that you stay tuned in to their outlets and to their news.
I'm going to stay on rhetoric because I think this is a really important point and kind of addresses two of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A. So words do matter. right? Rhetoric matters. These political speeches matter because they're meant to convey policy positions. They're meant to convey information about the character of the speaker. They're meant to create an emotional connection between the speaker and the audience, right? This is why politicians go out there and shake hands and kiss babies and take selfies, right? And this is true regardless of the politician's political beliefs, right? Politicians need to connect with voters to get votes so they can do the policy presumably the voters want, and rhetoric is the avenue through which that connection is established. There were concerns raised in the Q&A about a rhetoric that has been characterized as hostile to certain groups, of reminiscent of dark political eras in the past, right? Extreme language is used in political discourse because of something Dr. Wintersieck mentioned earlier, is that it fires people up positively or negatively. So if you present that there is a looming threat, you want people to be scared because you want them to be engaged, right? And that is a pattern that both political parties in this country use. What the threat is differs, right? But the idea that there is some looming threat that can only be addressed through participation in the 2024 electoral process is something that both sides are putting out as a message. Now, the question is, how did that become the only way through which politicians can connect with voters, right? By making people scared. And if we look back, to the not very far past, there were extraordinarily positive messages being put out by politicians, right? Visions for the future that were positive, that did not rely on fear-mongering. And I think part of that overall shift in tone is that positive visions became less effective, right? So we have pollsters, we have communications firms, we have this entire industry built around selling messages to us as consumers. And at some point, that industry decided that positive messages didn't sell, right? So not only do we have to hold politicians accountable and ourselves as individuals accountable for the language that we use, but acknowledge that there is this industry, a massive industry around electoral politics in this country that is also selling us on this fear, right? And so I don't know enough about the inner workings of any political party to say, if that's the only reason why this rhetoric is being used, but it is absolutely a reason why this rhetoric is being used. And so in our kind of blanket of accountability, I would also like us to address that fact as well. And we need to be more receptive to positive messages. We need to be more receptive about policy, right? Things that we actually care about rather than falling for these meta narratives of threat.
Yeah, I would say that I might be the outlier here, but I don't like negative rhetoric or scary rhetoric, and I feel like I've been seeing it in political campaigns for a long time. What I feel like is a bigger problem right now is just sort of a growing tolerance for political violence or destruction of some kind. And a tolerance, by that I mean it's excused away, or it's not prosecuted, or rules are not equally enforced, depending on if you favor the ideology of the group that's protesting or not. So I personally feel like that is more of a problem than rhetoric. And they could be linked, for sure, but I see that in the last, maybe 6 to 8 years, as more extreme than what we've seen with rhetoric.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, in the last 10 years alone, we've seen the erosion of several democratic norms. So it didn't used to be a norm of making fun of your challenger's hands on the debate stage. That was like not a thing that seemed to happen before 2016, but a lot has changed in the last 10 years alone. And I do see what you're saying about sort of norms kind of changing, and people sort of accepting this rhetoric is what seems to be new. Well, I wanted to close, since we only have a couple more minutes, I wanted to close with something that might be slightly a positive question about solutions. What can we do to prevent violence in the future? What strategies have proven effective in preventing violence? Like, if you're able to answer that question, anybody feel free to jump in. And if everyone would like to weigh in, we should have enough time for everyone to weigh in.
Sure. I would say that if we go back to the very beginning of this conversation, I think that it's really important that we begin to build more trusting relationships, like one-on-one with individuals. And, hopefully downstream, this can lead to more trust in our institutions. And I think that the best way we can do this, we used to have this saying in political science that all politics are local. And in the past 20 years, that narrative has really changed. All politics have become national, and they become national because of a lot of the things we've been talking about here tonight. And so I think that it's really important that citizens take their politics back, and they take it back to the local level, because regardless of your partisan identification, we can all agree on very certain things, right? That pothole in front of your house, everybody hates it. Everybody hates it. And if we can connect on small local issues and solve small local issues together, we can begin to build trust in our neighbors. We can begin to humanize them and see them as the people they are. And if we can do that, we can begin to engage in more difficult dialogue in a way that's respectful of individual divisions and individual policy positions.
Yeah, I always like to say, if you know where you disagree, then you probably also know where you agree, and you can kind of start there. Like, where do we agree? Where can we find commonality? And as long as we're willing to listen and not shut people down or say you have no right to speak about this or something like that, I think communication and looking for points of agreement are sort of the keys.
I think that as a society, our listening skills have atrophied to the point where they're almost non-existent, right? And what we need now is to develop our own skills as people and the skills of younger generations to listen to understand, not to listen to respond, right? So to Dr. Keena's points about jokes, it's right, you don't need to fire back with a joke. You don't need to fire back with a sassy comment. You don't need to agree to listen, right? It's incredibly important to listen to those with whom you disagree, to be better aware of where they're coming from, what their perspective is, and how you can persuade them, how you might be able to persuade them, right? Because no one is persuaded by being called a bad person. And that's the dynamic that we're seeing in our political discourse. If you don't share this view with me, then you're a bigot. If you don't share this perspective, right, then you want to protect this group or this interest. And it's not persuasive. You're not winning anyone over, right? So you have to listen to understand what the root of that individual's perspective or belief is on any particular issue before you can even begin to persuade them. And I think we all just need to focus on honing and developing those skills. And it sounds a little bit like, I'm advocating that everyone go into therapy, and it's not that. It's that we've spent so much time disconnected from human conversation, low stakes conversation, that every conversation is difficult and hard and emotional and upsetting. And if we really took the time to listen and understand, I don't think that would be the case.
Yeah, it seems to me that in the social media era, it's hard to have a low key conversation because everything's out there and everyone sees it. And there is some element of our dialogue being kind of performative when we engage, at least on social media. There are so many good questions that have come in at the very end, but unfortunately we're out of time. I just want to thank the audience for bringing excellent questions, and of course, thank our panelists for coming together and sharing their expertise. We're going to be doing more of these events in the future, and we are very pleased to have you all here. Thanks a lot. Have a great rest of the summer, and take care of yourselves.
Thank you.